Good evening, all. I'm going to give it just a minute for folks to trickle in, and then we'll get going tonight. As you come in, you'll see a poll launch, just a very brief little poll. If you could fill that out, that'd be great. Do another one at the very end. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, and then if people trickle in, that will be just fine. My name is Tal Kitron with Appleroot Tutoring Services. I'm an elite tutor specializing in test prep, so SCT and ACT, and I also do executive function coaching. Today, we're going to be here to talk about the new-ish ACT, understand how it's changed, how it's the same, but also just how to prepare. So talk strategy. As we go today, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. You should see that up top, and I will get to those at the end. And other than that, I think we should be here probably 40, 45 minutes or so. I'll make sure we're out of here within an hour, and I'll leave some time for questions at the end. Here's our plan today. We're going to talk format of the new enhanced ACT. We'll talk about what has changed from the old paper version. Although I guess we'll talk about also if you want to take it on paper versus online. We'll mention just kind of the differences and what to do if you have the choice. But we'll just talk what has changed from the old version of the ACT, what's the same. Look at content of each section. That's English, math, reading, and then the optional science section. Some strategies along the way, and then we'll talk at the end about some testing timelines. So when to prepare, when to register, and then how to prepare. So the rollout started last year, about a year ago. The digital ACT in April of 2025 kind of premiered the new version. And then in September of last year is when my students started to take the new ACT for the most part. So if they were domestic, not international, that was really the beginning. But now all of the ACTs are the new version. So there's no like old version versus enhanced version. It's just the ACT as it is. And we'll talk about what that looks like. So if you are taking an ACT in February or in April or in June or July or this year, you'll be taking the version we're talking about today. So here's the scoring, very different from SAT. You get 8 points just for showing up, 2 points per section, although I guess now that may have changed to 6. Regardless, we're going to want to score higher than that. A perfect ACT score is a 36 composite. The composite score is reached by averaging English, math, and reading. And then it's always rounded. So if you get like a 33.5, that's a composite 34. But if you have a 33.25, that rounds down to a 33. You can see here the timing, which we'll flesh out on the next slide. But English is 50 questions in 35 minutes. Pretty fast paced, but not a section that a lot of people have too much of a timing issue with. Math is 15 minutes for 45 questions, more of a time crunch for sure. Same with reading, 40 minutes for 36 questions. And then the optional science section is also very fast paced. The composite score, again, is just the English, math, reading. So one of the biggest changes for the ACT is that the science section, which I remember back in early 2000s when I took an ACT, I was like, what the heck is this? It kind of comes out of nowhere. It's different than a lot of standardized testing sections. So they've made that optional. Many students will still take it, and we'll talk about reasons why you would or wouldn't. But just knowing that it is now an optional section. It's not included in the composite score, and unless you opt in, you won't be taking a science. You'll just be taking English, math, and reading. Here's what that would look like without science. It's 2 hours and 5 minutes, much shorter than the 3 hours that it used to be. I find that to be really helpful for like my students with time and a half accommodations. So this is regular time. But many students, if you have an IEP or 504 plan in school for processing or ADHD or dyslexia or any sort of learning disability, just knowing that you need to apply for time and a half on the ACT. But what's nice is now if you get that, it's not like you're there for 5 hours. So it used to be time and a half was a bit of a blessing and a curse. And now it's just really a blessing. It's if you need the time and a half, you get it. You're not going to be sitting there all day and losing focus, but 3.5 hours as opposed to two-ish. Much more doable. English has 6 passages. That'll be our first section we dive into a little bit more. Math is all multiple choice. It used to be 5 choices, but now it's only 4. So A, B, C, D, no choice E. 10-minute break after math, and then the reading section, which for some people will be the last thing. 4 passages, 36 total questions, all multiple choice. And then optional science. So 7 passages, 40 questions, again, all multiple choice. So what is the ACT test? It's about 80% overlap with SAT. The newer version is much more similar to the current SAT, in my opinion. We're going to be tested on standard grammar, which a lot of people have learned and forgotten or not learned perfectly. High school math, the ACT is know a little bit about a lot. So the SAT, you know a lot about a little. Master the algebra, you're good. For ACT, you really need to know like just a grab bag of things. So they might test you on a geometry question and then say, hey, you remember logarithms? If so, here's a point. Remember how matrices work? Here's a point. So it can be frustrating because you really have to get a background and surface level knowledge of a ton of stuff rather than just specializing in the algebra like for SAT. Reading comprehension, so especially on the reading section, as you might think, and then vocab. And then graph reading and data interpretation, a little bit on math, but then mostly on that science section. So the SAT has worked those graphs into the verbal sections, weirdly. The ACT still has science, which is more about graph reading. So some general strategy that applies throughout, and then we'll go into English specifically. Number 1, to practice, I'll give you resources at the end, but practice your pacing. It's less fast-paced than it used to be. We have more time per question, but it's still fast. Rule number 1 is answer what the question's asking. So don't skip steps, read the whole question and the whole passage if appropriate. Rule number 2 is keep it simple. The ACT writers don't hide the ball. There's usually an easy method of solving and a simple solution. And then rule 3, leave nothing blank. There's no free response. There's multiple choice for everything. So there are no points off for wrong answers. There is no guessing penalty. Therefore, leave nothing blank. But do strategically skip around. So if there's a question taking you too long or you're not comfortable, just guess and move on. Don't leave it blank, but spend your time elsewhere. But if you're out of time, we're going to bubble straight down the line just to make sure we have an answer for everything. So let's start with English. Some of you will be taking this on paper, some of you online. If you have the choice, I recommend registering on paper for now, just because the online platform is a little bit glitchy and sketchy at the moment. I think it'll be fine, but I recommend the paper test if you have the choice. For ACT English, whether you're online or on paper, it's going to be testing grammar and rhetorical skills. 6 passages, either 10 or 5 questions apiece. And we'll dig into a little bit to just how this looks and what you can expect. Which is really the name of the game on ACT and standardized tests, is know what to expect. These are not tests of intelligence, they're tests of effort. If you understand what to expect and what the writers do, you can game the system. So for grammar, we'll just use the answer choices. They'll say which choice is most grammatically correct in context. Well, okay, depends on what they're testing. Here I see verbs. And specifically, I see glide versus glides, which is plural versus singular. So we could look at that and say, well, what is gliding? Not the mountaintops, but the subject after the eagle. We say the eagle glide, or the eagle were gliding, or the eagle gliding. No, the eagle glides, singular. So you know a lot just from the answer choices, and then it can often lead us to crossing out answers and then eventually to the correct choice. But don't sleep on the choices. Remember, these test writers, basement dwellers who write test questions all day, every day, their job is to write a question, a correct answer, and 3 to fool you. So you can use those 3 meant to fool you as guides. That's kind of test taking 101 and just being an expert rather than thinking like a test taker. We're thinking like the writers. So here's just an example of an English passage. The questions now on the right would all say which choice is most grammatically correct in context, but I don't think that adds a whole lot. And in fact, these questions are all pretty much testing the same thing. For number one, your strategy would be, I see a semicolon, I see a colon, I see a comma. Well, semicolons are like periods. On the ACT, they're basically identical. They must separate two full sentences. And circular patterns made of sand is not a full sentence. So A is out. 100% incorrect, grammatically wrong, because it doesn't do what a semicolon should do. Next easiest would be D, the colon, which requires a full sentence before. And then the colon is like a drum roll. It doesn't have to introduce a list. It could, but it probably won't on the ACT. Here it just introduces what was the surprise, drum roll please, circular patterns made of sand. That's our answer. Number two is only testing commas. And for that, you always want to look at the answer with none first. So choice B to see if it'll work. Here we just trust our ear and make an extra long pause where we do see a comma. So B would be, these circles were often over 7 feet in diameter and contain concentric rings and ridges, making them appear much like a target or landing pad. It leaves something to be desired. That making them appear is a brand new idea. So we want choice A. They were often over 7 feet in diameter and contain concentric rings and ridges, making them appear. There's your new dependent clause. Finally, for three, we said periods and semicolons are the same. B and D are wrong. Can't both be right. They're identical. They're both out. That's a great, easy trick. And then I see some dashes, but they're just like compound words here. There's no M dashes aside from the one after away. That's a red flag. If you have a dash as an answer, it's usually because there's a second one on this test. So here we're just going to say a comma. Although these patterns are short-lived, as currents gradually erode them away, the circles would periodically appear. If you do these over and over and get the rules down, it becomes second nature. But the problem with English is the curve is rough. So out of the 45, 50 questions, you got to nail almost all of them to get a really good score. So these were all punctuation clauses questions. That's the most common thing you'll see. Here are the other things you can expect to see. Redundancy. They will say which choice is least redundant in context, and you'll pick the shortest answer. That is probably 6, maybe 10 questions out of the 50, like a ton of them. Verbs, pronouns, so like I versus me, who versus whom. And then possession, so knowing that it's apostrophe S is it is, for example. Modifiers where words are moving around. Connectors like however and nevertheless. And then generally brevity, we like short answers for grammar. It's a pretty finite amount of topics, a little bit more than SAT grammar, but still not unconquerable. The other types of questions you'll see on English are rhetoric, rhetorical skills. And for these, we do not care about short answers. So your mentality is completely different. All we care about is context and if it stays on topic or transitions smoothly. That's all we're thinking of. So for like a question here where they're asking, at this point, the writer is considering adding the following statement, you would have to look at the context, which you don't have here, and say, yes, this would be great. It kind of makes it flow, or oh no, it's better without. Once you decide the yes, no, the rest of these are usually pretty simple. So just understanding this is completely different from grammar, but also exists on English. Here's an example of one of those. This question is just saying we want to provide specific information about the hobbies. This is very easy. You want to have blinders on and just think, oh, specific. Which answer has the most specific information? A is kind of general. B is incredibly specific and definitely our right answer. And then C and D are, again, too general. So we don't need to think necessarily about writers or what we would put in, but just accomplishing a task kind of robotically. So this one would definitely just be B, as in boy. The types you'll see are order placement, writer's goal, add, delete, and then accomplish a task. And again, your job is not pick the best answer, but eliminate the ones that for sure do not work. That is kind of a theme on standardized tests, especially the ACT. If an answer doesn't flow smoothly, doesn't stay on topic, we don't want it in there. It's going to be hard sometimes to stay objective with these. So you have to try to think of one of many test takers and you have the same clues on the page as those other test takers. Final tips for English before we jump into math. Differentiate between grammar and rhetoric. It's very obvious. Grammar questions have little punctuation or verbs or grammar rules. Rhetoric has a job for you to do. And then out of the 36 points, treasure each question as if it's worth a point on English, because it probably is, right? If you go 49 for 50, you probably are losing one of those points and getting a 35 or 34. Always pay attention to what the question's asking. If you're confused, don't think hard, just reread the question, the answers, and relevant portion of the passage. So that's English, really about refreshing your grammar rules and just getting practice. Let's talk math. 50 minutes for 45 questions, and they start off easier, they get harder as we go. They do test geometry, but do not provide the formulas that the SAT provides. They do allow your calculator, and somebody mentioned this in the question and answer, that the online version of the ACT offers the built-in Desmos graphing calculator, which is huge for SAT. I mean, it's a game-changing, absolute cheat code. The Desmos calculator allows you to graph parabolas and do also for 42 here, we could definitely do that on Desmos. The only reason I said earlier that I recommend the paper ACT over online still is because the online ACT is still in its fledgling stages. And in my experience, it has had a lot of issues. There's little things, just the highlighting tool is not great. And I just don't trust it yet completely. I think it's probably fine to take an ACT online if you prefer the Desmos and the computer, aspect of it. So it's not a strong, you must take paper, but that's the reason I would say it. It's just the online ACT, I don't know. I'll believe it when I see it that they've got all the kinks worked out. That being said, whether you're taking the paper or online version of the ACT, you can and should bring your own graphing calculator. So TI-84 or whatever, almost everything would be legal. And then they'll provide scratch paper, but if it's on paper, you write in the booklet. And if it's online, you just have scratch paper to work stuff out. Grab bag of varied concepts. So anything from a logic question to geometry to inequalities, we see all of those here. So what's our strategy? Rule number one is always got to know what we're solving for. So on the paper test, we're going to be really marking up that booklet. Circle what you're solving for, got to know. There are still quite a few word problems. Translate those into math, right? Very important and need to do it right. So sometimes the art of translation is something students need refreshers on in tutoring sessions. Show your work. I'm sure every math teacher ever has said that, and use your calculator when appropriate. No mental math because there's no points awarded for that. And then check your answer. Nobody's going to see the work you showed, so I think that's really for your benefit. We have to move quickly, so checking your answer is within reason, but just a logic check, right? If it's an angle measure, does it look like 30 or 180? So yeah, these are kind of basic math rules just to keep in mind for any math test you take. Now let's talk about what you're going to see. So big thing to look out for that a lot of students need a review on is SOHCAHTOA. And reminder that you do not get formulas, so you have to memorize Pythagoras, but also the special right triangles, 30, 60, 90, 45, 45, 90. Need to know area, perimeter, volume, the difference between circumference, which is 2 pi r, and area of a circle, which is pi r squared. If you know those things, these questions are very easy. Like tangent of A here is just big A over big B, choice A, because it's just opposite over adjacent. But if you haven't done that in a few months or years, you're going to need the review. So it's not rocket science. It's not hard math a lot of times. It's just, hey, remember this? And sometimes we don't. Here's an example of a trigonometry question, or maybe geometry, because it doesn't necessarily mention sine, cosine, tangent. You've got the shape, you've got some information that's redundant, and the question is, how high up does the wall go? Right? Or how high up does the ladder go up the wall? So the height of this triangle. If it's not a special right triangle with a root 3 or a root 2, Pythagoras is probably our best option. That's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Not provided, but most students have that memorized. We know the c, the hypotenuse, is 26, and 24 is either one of the legs, so a or b. So that translates to 24 squared plus b squared is 26 squared. Your calculator can do that work for you, especially if we're online and use Desmos. But either way, we calculate it and find that b squared is 100, so b is 10, and that's our answer. Bonus would be if you knew that this was a Pythagorean triplet multiple, so 5, 12, 13, 10, 24, 26, you could get this in a couple seconds, but I don't expect that. Here's a probability question. Another just example that I think is actually quite hard. We have 9 macadamias, 13 cashews, 18 peanuts, and the question is, how many additional cashews do we add so that the probability of randomly drawing a cashew is 2 out of 5? I think you could lean on the answer choices, but there is a better option for these. When you are being asked a question like this, focus on what's not changing. We're adding cashews, but we're not changing the other 2 types. So instead of focusing on what will make the cashews 2/5, it's, hey, what will make the macadamias plus the peanuts 3/5? Because there's 9 macadamias, 18 peanuts, and those aren't changing. 9 plus 18 is 27. So we're trying to figure out that 27, that would be 3/5 of what number? A proportion is very common to set up. 27 is to what as 3 is to 5? 27 over x equals 3 over 5. That x will be the total number of nuts at the end, which is 45. And so we started out with 9 plus 13 plus 18, which is 40. That must mean that we had to add 5 cashews to get to our final proportion. This is the hardest question that we've seen so far today, definitely harder than that last one. So if you're looking at this thinking, man, I wouldn't do it that way, or I'm a little bit lost, that's okay. This is a bit trickier than what we've seen. The main takeaway, though, is if you're not going to use the answers just as guides, you should probably use what isn't changing. And I don't think that's intuitive at all. So I find this to be a pretty hard question. And it would take probably 2 or 3 during session time for most students to have that really click. So final tips for math, again, all multiple choice, leave nothing blank, but show your work, use your calculator. Easier questions at the beginning, but sometimes you'll hit like 25 and think, man, I don't know this anymore. And so maybe you should skip that instead of spinning your tires. It is fine and expected, honestly, to not get to every question for most students, but don't leave anything blank. I recommend going straight down the line because if you Christmas tree it, let's say you got 10 questions left, you go A, B, C, D, C, B, A, B, C, D, you are very likely to miss every single one of them. But if you go B, 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 or D, 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 you're going to get a couple of them, just statistically. So you're better off doing that. That might be a difference of 2, 3, 4 points on the ACT math, is how you guess. I recommend reviewing basic geometry and trigonometry rules like SOHCAHTOA and stuff like mean, median, mode. Just don't want to get caught off guard by anything that you should know and haven't thought about forever. Draw shapes for geometry questions if they don't give you one. And then if you get stuck, like the answer choices are there for a reason. Use them if they're friendly, and if not, maybe pick your own numbers like a 2 or a 3 and just plug them in so it's not abstract. Generally, easy solutions if you're taking a long time on something for math, you want to just move past it. Go grab lower hanging fruit. Reading, the last required section. 40 minutes, 4 passages, 9 questions apiece. And that's a bit of a time crunch. That's a lot of stuff, especially because it's the third section. So we have our 10-minute break and we come back and just get launched into this. 3 of the 4 passages are what we call informational. So they're just fact-based. Try to read those in more like 2 to 3.5 minutes maximum. Right? We have 10 minutes total per passage, but you want to read fast for the informational. And then we get about 30 seconds per question. Right? So you have a time to eliminate a couple answers, pick one, and move on. But if you take notes really well on these informational passages and mark up the margins, you don't have to spend as much time going back and forth from those questions to the passage, which is inevitable. We'll do some of that. Reading is probably the number one reason why I recommend paper over online. If you go on the ACT website and you try their online practice, they have not fixed this glitch where when you highlight on the reading section, so it's really nice. You can read through it, you can highlight, nice little tool. As soon as you go from question 1 to 2, all your highlights disappear. So like, it's not the end of the world, not the worst thing, but it's annoying. It's not like the Blue Book SAT platform. And so like if I was doing online reading, my students right now, I'm telling them mostly have scratch paper and write your notes on paper rather than trying to highlight because you're going to lose those. So yeah, math might be a point in favor of online, but I think reading's a big one in favor of paper test, especially because it's just nice to be able to mark up the passage and write in the margins. One of the 4 is literary narrative. Some people like this the best, but even if they do, it might take them too long. So consider maybe doing this out of order. It's often the first one. Here, I'd take more like 3 to 4 minutes reading. Immersive approach. Notes aren't as important. We're about characters, emotions, relationships. That's what the questions will get to. So instead of hunting for clues and like taking simple outline notes like I would do on the other passages, I would just read this like a story, right? Don't get too bogged down. If I don't understand something, move on. But just trying to get a vibe for who the people are and their relationships in the passage. And if it's like 8 paragraphs out of a novel, there's not going to be a whole lot that happens. So some reading questions that you might see. How is the passage organized, or what's the structure? And then you'll have 4 choices. Some questions are about the narrator or the author. A lot of main idea questions. So for a passage or just a paragraph, that's where notes can be very, very helpful. And then specific detail or vocab, right? As used in line 27, the word ubiquitous most nearly means what? And you just look up and down for context. Just like on the other sections, I might pick 1 question per passage to skip on purpose, just to save time, momentum, confidence, and energy. For the reading part of the reading, so you always start with a passage, an excerpt of an article or a novel or an essay. Active reading is pencil in hand, at least paper version. And passive reading is this and then that, right? Not good, going to end up probably costing us time, but also we lose focus. So it's mostly to keep the energy up and stay on and just focused in, but underlining, circling, starring, most importantly, taking basic notes in the margins. Not annotation, but a simple note that sums up a paragraph or a big idea. You do not have to go in order on the passages. You do not have to go in order on the questions. Many students will strategically skip around a little bit to preserve time. And in the goal of reading, it's not to understand or remember or take note of everything you see. It's impossible and not desirable. Tag where you saw stuff so that when you go to the questions, hopefully quickly, you can go back from the questions and choices to those parts and you know where to be. So the reading part is big. You gotta, if people struggle for time, it's almost always because they take far too long reading and are seeking too many unnecessary details rather than staying on the surface. And then as far as the questions is, we want elimination. Do not look for the best answer, look for the least bad. There are what are called throwaway words that the basement dwelling test writers put in to make answers intentionally wrong. And in that vein, we don't like peacock, flashy answers. So nothing that says, oh yeah, every scientist or nobody or all or everyone. I'd rather say something like, this may provide context, right? Like that's a sparrow answer that says nothing, but I can't argue with that. So for reading, we like these general kind of broad answers rather than the flashy peacock answers. And then last little bit on reading. So inferring versus assuming, we do not want to assume. We barely want to infer. Even if they say what is implied or what is indicated or what can be inferred, don't bring in outside information. Do not overanalyze or be too thoughtful. Just think about what were the clues there for me and everybody else, right? So inferring, we really don't have to infer. It should still be enough clues on the page for us to get it. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about science. It is optional. And if you opt in, it's $4. So it's just another way for ACT to make money. STEM students might still want to do it. We're generally recommending take the science section when all else is equal. I'm going to learn more about how college are going to handle it. It's not included in the composite score, but like if you are thinking about math or engineering or any sort of science major, you may just want to have it because then that's a supplemental score that's like, okay, composite ACT out of 36, and then science separate also out of 36. So we'll look at kind of what this section looks like, and then I see some questions, so I'll answer those at the end. The big thing for science is it has gotten a little bit more sciencey, but it's still mostly about reading graphs. 40 questions, 40 minutes, a minute per question. Passages have like a bunch of graphs in them usually, and then 5 to 7 associated questions that you then have to kind of navigate and think, okay, do I care about the passage here? Is it more of a graph question or is it outside knowledge? It's a lot of information, and so we don't have much time to really understand or compute all of it. So the general rule is skim or just skip the passage and graphs and go straight to the questions. One thing I would always do is stay on the surface. A lot of the science might even be interesting or like, oh man, I learned this in physics or chemistry, but now I've forgotten. Do not worry about that. A lot of the info provided is not going to be tested. And then we have to really use the answer choices and the questions to match. This is not like reading the whole thing and then doing it holistically like, another section. It'd be, what are the questions and choices providing? And then where exactly do I go to match? There's usually a perfect match. If we take too long, skip a question and move on. In my experience, the last question or two of each passage can be harder. I don't think that's always true, but if I was skipping questions, it would be usually the last one or two of each passage. All right, just go get easier points and come back later. Some traps to be aware of and avoid. One is definitely go to the right graph. If they say figure 2, don't go to figure 3, right? It can be alarmingly simple to do that by accident. If it says, the question says, according to the passage or based on the information provided, some of what you need is in the text. So don't go there first, but that's a question that would indicate we need to. And then really try not to care about the science itself. Just go make a match. We only have time for that. We can't really think about the actual science behind it. Some things you will see. We're going to look at a couple of graph questions for trends, relationships. Sometimes you have to expand that pattern and extrapolate given a trend. The harder questions ask about scientific methods, so independent, dependent variables. Why did they do this? If we were to try to change something to get this result, what could we do? So those you put your science cap on, but you don't really, again, think too hard. Not rocket science, but more like 6th grade science. If they ask you how experiments differ, just go straight to experiment 2. They'll usually say, we repeated the exact same thing from experiment 1, except, and that would be your answer. Right? So again, they're not hiding the ball. You just got to go find it. Here's an expand the pattern question. And people will look at the next few practice things and be like, well, I've taken ACT and it's not this easy. There are science questions that are this easy, I promise. Here the question is, table 2, a sequoia produced sap for a period of 370 years would have a sap production of what? And I'm looking at the answers and I'm thinking that, okay, sap production period of 370 is right here. And then that is increasing. So if I draw an arrow towards the biggest number and I want to know what the sap production is, well, it seems like it's going to be over 3640. Sometimes the answer will be in the middle of the pattern, but a lot of times at the beginning or end. As long as you look at the right parts of this table, this is a very, very easy question, and it is something that would come up on science. Here's another. Question here being, at which of the following surface temperatures would the luminosity of a star in galaxy B be closest to 2 times the luminosity of a star in galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000? So I'd first be looking at, well, luminosity. I don't see that. Probably on the graph, when they say RL, you would be able to go back to the passage, and I'm sure it's like, oh, RL means relative luminosity, right? It's going to point you in an easy direction. At 3000, galaxy B is at 1 luminosity. Question is, when will it be 2? And that looks like about right there. Same dashed line for galaxy B, and then you could just draw a line down and see that looks like about 3300. So that was an extra step, not the easiest question, but not rocket science. As long as you read that question correctly and use the choices and graph to full advantage, we're golden. And then another just kind of simple relationship question. Figure 3 support which of the following hypotheses? As the surface temperature, x-axis of a star increases, the average size, the y-axis, does what? Well, it's not a constant rate, but it never plateaus, it never goes down. Our answer is clearly B. Direct relationship between surface temperature and the size. Tips and tricks for science if you take it. So for one thing, it's the last section. You'll be kind of sometimes tired, ready to get out of there. So just try to make it as clue-oriented, methodical as possible. Glance at the graphs and passage, but don't try to understand it all. It's impossible, and we don't want to. Actively read the question and the answers, and then match back to the graphs. If there's not a match, use the passage, and if there's still no match, that's when we actually have to think a little bit just about like basic scientific method and how you set up scientific experiments and so on. Last few slides for today, and then we'll open up for questions, are going to be just about like how to prepare, testing timeline. So one little note is that if you're taking the ACT in February, or if you took it, you do want to request my answer key, which used to be called test information release. It is something the SAT no longer offers. It's hugely helpful. It gives you back the test. So like once you take it, you can get the copy of the test itself, your answers, and the actual like scoring table and answer keys. So like in a tutoring session, it's so helpful. It's like, hey, I took this real test. Can we go over the questions I missed? Right? Really useful way to spend our time. So yeah, just if you're taking February, September, December, I highly recommend purchasing this. And the way to do it is just on the ACT website. Some common questions that we may get are, when should I begin preparing? Typically the answer is during junior year. If you're very high scoring, maybe summer before junior year, but generally want to have at least Algebra 2 under your belt, if not a bit of pre-calc even for ACT. So sometime during junior year. I've got a lot of students who kind of just are starting. AP exams can obviously conflict this time of year. So some people start in the summer and prepare for fall tests. What is a good ACT score? Well, the national average is probably like a 20 or so, but most students wouldn't be happy with it. A good score is a score that makes you competitive for the schools you want to apply to, right? So do that research and see where we need to be. And then accordingly, you can decide, all right, it takes most students several tests to reach full potential. Should you send all those results? Not necessarily. Many colleges super score the ACT or SAT, which means if you scored like a 32 on English and a 30 on math, but the next time you got a 34 on math, they would just see the highest two scores, the 32 and the 34. I would say about half of colleges and universities super score, so it's a great reason to take the ACT more than once. Doesn't mean you should take it and focus just on English and then just on math or just on reading, but it does mean that on the second or third go, you can focus on one individual section to improve, right? But not the first time. So how to prepare? We have several new mock ACTs. Those provide really nice score results, question types that you missed, and anything that you got wrong. So that's an easy thing and nice thing to do during a session, just reviewing with students. The ACT official website has 2 free practice ACTs that are brand new. They're in PDF form, or you can find them online. It's a bit tough to find, but if you search for online ACT practice, you'll see it. And then official ACT prep guide, this big red book for 25-26 has 4 official ACTs. I think if you buy this book, you can do them online, is what it says, or on paper. We talked about getting my answer key from the real test. And then even if you don't do tutoring for a group or individual, the ACT guide, I'm biased, but it's new and it's really, really good. You can get that just a la carte for probably, I don't know, $30. Don't quote me. And there's a new science supplement as well. But the ACT guide really breaks down everything, especially like hundreds of pages of math because of all the different topics that they test. So those are a lot of good ways. If you didn't get all that down, fear not, these slides will be sent, or the presentation is generally sent on Friday, so tomorrow. There's no wrong time to test, but you do want to plan for 2 or 3. It takes most students 3 official tests to reach their full potential for various reasons. And the test dates, unless you have an in-school one, are going to be February, April, June, July, September, October, December. Plenty of options. Just got to think about how does it conflict with extracurriculars, finals, APs, and so on. And then just want to reiterate that this is not a test of intelligence. It does not in any way reflect on you as a person. It is a test of effort and how well you do on the test on that day. So like no matter what you do, focus on staying healthy and getting rest the couple days before the test. That'll probably be the #1 most important thing. That's all I've got. I'm going to put up this AP slide with a QR code because I'm not teaching any of them, but we have many AP workshops coming up. You'll also see a second poll launched, should have just come up for you. I'll leave this up for a moment, and then if you have no questions and you feel good, hopefully this was helpful, you can feel free to call it an evening. Thank you for joining. And in a minute here, I'll just answer the questions that we've got and any more that come in. And I mean, we also have many tutors who do individual AP, but these are nice little workshops if you just want to get in. And these are all tutors who have experience getting students 4s and 5s and really specialize in this stuff. All right, let's open it up for questions. I've already seen a few good ones come in. So a couple of questions. First one is, how does the ACT impact the way the students should prepare? So I'm not sure if I understand exactly, but what I would say is ACT versus SAT, for example, because it's not a test of intelligence, it's a test of effort, it's about repetition. And so like those materials that I listed as an example, like you just got to miss questions and learn from them. So that's what I do in a tutoring session is the most productive students are the ones who we've assigned some work or a test. They've got a list of the questions that they miss and don't really understand. So we knock those out together. Generally, time on task is the key though, right? You need, if you're not getting support from a tutor or a group, you can still do it individually, but you have to put in an hour every other day for, a couple months. And if you do that, the scores will improve, right? You just get the repetition. Another question is, if you get stuck, but then you guess, is that a good strategy? I think it is, because you do not want to spin your tires and spend 2 minutes. It is better to get a question wrong in 30 seconds than to get it right in 2 minutes, which is really counterintuitive. So yeah, I would say if you get stuck, you definitely want to guess and move on. You can also mark it for review and just come back later. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's the right move is don't dwell on it. Don't be like, I have to get this question right. It's not your typical test where you've got to get 100. Next is if a student took Algebra 1 in 8th grade, and then Algebra 2 in 9th, and 10th grade is pre-calc and then geometry. The question is the ACT maybe better and allow her to capitalize on what she just learned versus the SAT, which tests stuff back in the day? It's an interesting question. In a way, yes, because the geometry would be fresher, and the ACT does test a lot of geometry. But the problem with ACT is they test so many things that there's also stuff from Algebra 1 and arithmetic, right? And so, like, yes, but for some students, they prefer to go back to the algebra they learned a few years ago and just master it. So I think that is one of the biggest question marks and choices between SAT, ACT is, are we super strong with algebra and willing to just dive in and get all the algebra stuff? If so, SAT is the move. If it's like, that's not my strength, I like geometry, I'm generally good at math, but I don't have a specialty, then maybe ACT math is better. But yeah, that's a tough one. It requires probably some thought and taking a practice test for each to see which one you like better. Next question is science recommended. So right now we are recommending it just because we're not sure exactly how colleges will deal with it. If you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the schools you're applying to are liberal arts colleges and you do not want to do STEM in any way, shape, or form, you're probably safe not taking science. But otherwise, you should probably take it when you register. Next, good questions. When sending ACT scores to colleges, will the college see all my test scores I took, or will be able to see how many times I took the tests? You can count on one hand the amount of colleges that require you to submit all test scores. So it is extremely rare that a college would know how many times you took it. You probably don't want to take it more than 3 or 4 times. Usually after that, we're reaching diminishing returns. But the answer is like Columbia or maybe like a couple colleges like that, like Georgetown, they require you to send all scores from all sittings. So better just get it, done in a couple chances versus most vast majority of colleges, like any Big Ten or SEC school or most schools, you can choose which scores you send, and if they super score, you can send them all. They'll only see the highest and not how many times you took it. And the ACT kind of automatically super scores on their website when you've taken multiple tests. Another one is how many questions can you get wrong without it counting against you? It depends on the curve. On English, if you miss a question, it probably costs you a point. The scoring tables are available online, and usually you can see usually a question missed is a point. Unless you get a perfect, you're not going to get a 36. But there are times on math, for example, where maybe it was super hard and you missed 2 questions, and maybe still because of the curve get a perfect score. So I can't say for sure, but if you Google ACT scoring table, you can look at like what a raw score is and how that translates to your composite. It's also tricky because the ACT has some unscored questions that just don't count, and you can't really ever predict which ones those are on the test. All right, really good questions. If you have any others, reach out to this email below. We offer, standardized testing. That's my bread and butter, but executive function coaching, academic help, AP help. And if you just want clarification on anything from today, just shoot a message and someone will get back to you. Most of our client services folks are or were tutors at one point, so they very much know their stuff. Thank you guys so much for joining. Hope it was helpful. Have a wonderful rest of the evening and good luck on your ACTs.